What really pushed a woman to her limits? I let the question linger in my mind, hesitant to fully explore it. Time, years, numbers, the slow crawl of life, had settled over me like a quiet weight, inevitable and steady. But I'd come to realize that life wasn't just about the ticking clock or how old you were. It was about how you lived, the choices you made, the moments that shaped you, even the ones you didn't talk about. Was it relationships that tested those boundaries? Not exactly. Not in the way most people would assume. I'd been married to Rachel for 10 years, a solid decade of partnership, understanding, and a rhythm that felt predictable, almost comforting. We didn't have any major issues, nothing that threatened to tear down what we'd built. At least, that's what I told myself. But there were always those little things, the ones you couldn't quite put into words, the ones you ignored because it was easier that way. Shadows in the corners of an otherwise bright and orderly life. Lately, though, I'd noticed something shifting inside me, a vague, restless feeling I couldn't quite name. It had been there for a while, just beneath the surface, waiting. Then there was Tyler, Rachel's son from her first marriage. From the start, the word step had always felt awkward, like a wall between us. I hadn't raised him, but he'd been part of my life for years, a quiet, constant presence, always there but never fully there. Now, at 23, Tyler had grown into a confident, successful man. He was magnetic, undeniably good-looking, but there was something else about him, something that set him apart. He was reserved, not cold or unkind, but always holding something back. There was a distance in him, an invisible line he never crossed, no matter how much time passed. That space between us, that quiet, unspoken hesitation, was what unsettled me the most. It was like he was waiting for something neither of us could name. And that uncertainty? That's what made it dangerous. Because of that, I'd always been careful. I made sure the time we spent together was never too long, never too intimate. If Rachel was around, everything felt balanced. The boundaries were clear, the roles defined. There was nothing to question, nothing to fear. That's why this business trip to Chicago had been planned the way it was, seamless, predictable, with Rachel there to keep everything in its proper place. It was a given that she'd be there. Until she wasn't. That morning, as we sat at the breakfast table, the usual hum of conversation filling the room, Rachel spoke up mid-sentence, like the thought had just occurred to her. I won't make it. You two go ahead without me. There was a beat of silence, a moment suspended in time. I looked at her, waiting for a follow-up, a laugh, some kind of explanation to show she was joking. But there was nothing. She just took a sip of her coffee, the decision already made, the matter settled in her mind. Across from me, Tyler's fingers traced an idle pattern along the edge of his plate. His gaze stayed down, his expression unreadable. I don't have to go either, Dad, he said quietly, his voice calm and measured. Rachel shook her head. No, it's important that you go with Claire. You need the experience. Being around her will teach you a lot. Her words were casual, almost innocent, but as I sat there listening, I felt something else entirely, a tight knot forming in my stomach. For the briefest moment, my eyes flickered toward Tyler. I hadn't meant to look at him, but something in the air pulled my attention, like I could sense his presence before I even realized it. And sure enough, he was already looking at me. His eyes, those eyes, held something I couldn't quite name, something heavy and unspoken. It only lasted a few seconds, but in that fleeting moment, I felt something I'd been desperately trying to avoid, a shift, a warning, like the ground beneath me was starting to crack. We were going to be alone. Truly alone. Rachel pushed herself up from the table, stretching before resting a hand on my shoulder. Her usual easygoing smile played at her lips. Take care of him, she said, her tone light, almost teasing, like I was the responsible one, the one in control, the one who didn't need protecting. But there was something Rachel didn't know. Maybe the one who needed protecting was me. Some plans seemed flawless at first, polished and logical on paper. This trip to Chicago had been one of them. Turning a business meeting into a short family getaway had seemed like the perfect idea, a chance to blend work with a bit of leisure, to spend time together while introducing Tyler to the corporate world. It was an opportunity for him, a chance to make connections, to observe, to start carving out his own future. But things had changed. Rachel's last-minute change of plans meant Tyler and I would be making this trip alone. The realization settled in my chest with an unsettling weight. A quiet but undeniable undercurrent of something I couldn't quite define. Restlessness? Anticipation? That evening, the house was quiet, just the two of us. We sat together, going over the plans for the trip, but at some point, the conversation drifted. I found myself giving him advice, not just about the trip, but about the world he was stepping into. The kind of people he'd meet, the way he should carry himself, the strategies he should use to navigate the business landscape. But the more we talked, the more I felt it. Something had shifted. Maybe it was in the way he was watching me, not just listening but truly watching. Or maybe it was in the way my own words started to feel different, like I was trying to convince myself of something rather than just guiding him. Every time our eyes met, that familiar sensation, heavy, lingering, settled in the pit of my stomach. Wasn't Rachel supposed to set the boundaries? No, this time it had to be me. And yet, deep down, I already knew the truth. I wouldn't be able to. What if things slipped out of control simply because she wasn't there? I forced the thought away. The morning of our flight arrived with a gray, overcast sky, a fitting backdrop for the unsettled feeling lingering in my chest. At the airport, we sat side by side in silence. Tyler's hands were restless, rubbing together, tapping lightly against his knees. But it wasn't the usual quiet between us. There was something else underneath it, something neither of us had acknowledged aloud but had already begun to take shape. By the time we boarded the plane, that feeling had solidified. We took our seats, he had the window, I was next to him, and as the engines roared to life, I knew this trip was going to change everything. At first, it was just small talk, business projects, the weather in Chicago. But then his voice dropped into something softer. Honestly, he said, it's probably a good thing my dad didn't come. I turned to him, my throat suddenly dry. Why? I asked. Tyler shrugged, a slow, knowing smile pulling at his lips. Because you're different when he's around. Like you're avoiding something. My breath hitched. What did he mean? Was I? But the scariest part wasn't the question itself. It was the fact that Tyler had noticed. By the time we landed in Chicago, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. At the hotel lobby, we checked in for the reservation my company had arranged. The receptionist smiled as she handed over 2 key cards. Your family suite is ready, Missy. I frowned, my brows knitting together as I processed her words. Family suite? I repeated, my voice tinged with confusion. The woman at the front desk nodded confidently. Yes, a spacious suite with 2 beds. As far as I know, no additional room was booked under your reservation. A second passed, then another. I had been under the assumption that the company had arranged for 2 separate rooms, one for me and one for Tyler. But now, reality was settling in like a weight pressing against my chest. We weren't in different rooms. We were sharing a suite. Beside me, Tyler took a step closer, his presence steady and unwavering. It's fine, he said, his tone calm and collected, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. But that calmness did nothing to settle me. If anything, it twisted something deep in my stomach, tying a knot I wasn't sure I could undo. Was it really fine? As we stepped into the suite, I took in our surroundings. Everything felt too luxurious, the kind of place you might book for a romantic getaway, not a strictly professional work trip. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across one side of the room, showcasing Chicago's dazzling skyline, the city lights twinkling against the glass. The atmosphere inside was quiet, yet charged with something unspoken. There were 2 beds. That should have reassured me. It should have been enough to push away the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. And yet, something still felt off. Tyler moved effortlessly through the space, shrugging off his jacket and draping it over a chair. The casualness of his movements contrasted sharply with the tension buzzing under my skin. I drifted toward the window, pressing my fingertips lightly against the cool glass, staring out at the vast city below. Are you tired? Tyler's voice came from behind me, smooth and low. I closed my eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply. Why did such a simple question make my chest feel tight? I turned to face him, meeting his gaze. His eyes, soft, unreadable, held something deeper than I wanted to acknowledge, something that made my pulse stutter. Too deep, too dangerous. A little, I admitted. Tyler sat down on his bed, rolling his wrists and stretching, as if trying to ease some hidden tension of his own. Then, with a small, almost teasing smirk, he said, I know this is a work trip, but that doesn't mean we can't take some time to enjoy ourselves too, right? His words were light-hearted, casual, but something about them sent a warning bell ringing in the back of my mind. A flicker of something passed through his expression before he quickly masked it, leaning back against the pillows with an easy grin. Meet me at the hotel bar, he added, his voice carrying a trace of amusement. I need to unwind a little. I let out a slow breath, releasing some of the tension that had coiled inside me. I was overthinking, creating a problem where there wasn't one. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was being too rigid. There was nothing wrong with relaxing for a bit. I offered a small smile. Yeah, let's have some fun. The hotel bar was more elegant than I expected. Subdued lighting, soft jazz playing in the background, an intimate and refined atmosphere that blended seamlessly with the Chicago night. At first, I was still on edge, but after a few drinks, I felt the tension begin to loosen, like a tight rope slowly unraveling. We talked, we laughed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized how long it had been since I let myself simply enjoy the moment. Tyler looked different too, more relaxed, lighter, as if shedding a part of himself that was usually guarded. The drinks had started to strip away his usual reserve, making his movements a little bolder, his smiles a little longer, and his eyes lingered on me for just a beat too long. Our conversation shifted, taking on a depth that hadn't been there before, something subtle but undeniably charged. I told myself to stay cautious, to be mindful of the invisible lines I wasn't supposed to cross. But something inside me trembled, just slightly. Had I really never found him attractive before? Had I always known? Had the truth been there all along, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for me to acknowledge it? Or had I simply refused to admit it, choosing instead to bury it beneath layers of denial? Tyler leaned back, his posture relaxed but his gaze intense. His eyes were fixed on me, studying me carefully, as if trying to decipher my thoughts. He bit his lower lip just slightly, almost absent-mindedly. There was something about the way he looked at me, something unspoken hanging in the air between us. This wasn't the right moment. I knew that. The weight of realization pressed down on me, making it impossible to stay any longer. If I lingered, if I let this tension stretch any further, I wasn't sure what would happen, or if I was ready for it. I set my glass down on the bar with deliberate care, the sound of it meeting the wood barely audible over the quiet hum of the room. Taking a slow breath, I rose to my feet, forcing myself to put some distance between us. I'm heading upstairs, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside me. I have a meeting in the morning. You shouldn't stay up too late either. Tyler nodded, his expression unreadable. A small smile played at the corner of his lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. All right, see you. Good night. But those eyes, they told a different story. They held something unsaid, a quiet expectation, as if he was waiting for me to say something else, something I wasn't ready to put into words. By the time I reached my room, an unsettling feeling had settled deep within me. But it wasn't an uncomfortable kind of unease. It wasn't the kind that made me want to run. It was something else entirely, a loss of control, a quiet fear that I was on the edge of something I could no longer ignore. I dropped my bag in the corner, my movements slow and deliberate, as I turned toward the bathroom to change. My eyes caught on the jacuzzi in the corner of the room. The sight of it made me pause. Maybe I needed this. Maybe the heat of the water would help clear my mind, soothe the mess of thoughts swirling inside me. Tyler still hadn't come upstairs. That meant I had time to breathe, time to sort through the emotions I'd been trying so hard to push aside. Slipping into the warm water, I let my body sink into the heat, my muscles relaxing instantly. But my thoughts, they didn't quiet so easily. I replayed the last few moments, the way he had looked at me, the way his presence made something stir deep inside me, something I couldn't quite control. I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. Was this just the alcohol? Or had it been there all along, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for me to finally acknowledge it? No. I wasn't drunk enough to blame this on the drinks. This wasn't sudden. Wasn't fleeting. Tonight, for the first time, I had allowed myself to feel it, to stop suppressing what had been growing between us for so long. When I stepped out of the jacuzzi, the air felt cool against my skin. I wrapped myself in a robe, tying it securely around my waist, before heading toward my bed. But just as I was about to turn off the lights, something stopped me. Tyler. He was sprawled across his bed, his body completely at ease, his breathing slow and deep. He had fallen asleep, probably a little drunk. His shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the defined lines of his chest, his pants slightly undone, as if he had collapsed onto the bed without a second thought. A slow, unshakable warmth spread through me. God, he looked good. Too good. Seeing him like this, unguarded, vulnerable, did something to me. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just desire. It was deeper than that. Heavier. Something I couldn't name. I held my breath and quickly turned away, forcing myself to focus on changing. But even that wasn't easy. I could hear him, his breathing steady and rhythmic. It was oddly comforting, lulling in a way that made me feel both safe and completely on edge. At one point, I glanced up almost involuntarily. My eyes landed on him again, and this time, I didn't look away. And it hit me with full force. Tyler was breathtaking. Not just in a casual, fleeting way, no, he was the kind of beautiful that made you lose yourself, the kind that made it impossible to look at anything else. How much longer could I keep pretending this wasn't real? A quiet sigh escaped me. I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, and I knew it. Tyler, you should change, I said softly. His breathing shifted. A moment later, he stirred, his eyes blinking open, hazy from sleep. His gaze found mine, and for a second, we just looked at each other. Then he smiled. He shouldn't have, but he did. And that smile, that damn smile, unraveled me completely. His broad chest, his defined muscles, the way he looked so effortlessly perfect, it was too much. And I knew I had been looking too long, but I didn't stop. I didn't look away. Tyler, still smiling, let his eyes lock onto mine. And in that moment, I knew, tonight was just the beginning. The next morning, we both dressed with meticulous care, slipping into sharp, elegant outfits that spoke of quiet sophistication. The air in the room was still thick with the unspoken tension from the night before, lingering like a shadow neither of us wanted to acknowledge. And so, we pretended, as if nothing had happened, each playing our part in the delicate performance of normalcy. Golden streams of Chicago's morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long streaks across the room. As I adjusted the strap of my bag, my gaze fell on Tyler, who was buttoning up his crisp white shirt with deliberate, practiced movements. He was always so composed, so effortlessly confident. There was a quiet maturity about him that made him seem older than he really was, an undeniable presence that commanded attention. And, of course, he was handsome. Too handsome. Dangerously so. I swallowed, forcing my thoughts into order, and picked up my bag. Shall we go? I asked, my voice steady despite the conflicting emotions beneath the surface. Tyler swung his jacket over his shoulder in one smooth motion before turning to me, his eyes locking onto mine with quiet intensity. I'm ready, he said simply. And I was ready too, at least, I thought I was. But deep down, I wasn't entirely sure what I was ready for. By the time we stepped out of the meeting hours later, an unexpected sense of relief settled over me. It was subtle but undeniable. More than anything, I had wanted to observe Tyler, to see how he navigated this kind of professional setting, how he adapted to an environment where power wasn't just spoken but silently understood. I had expected him to need time to adjust, but I was wrong. He didn't have to say much. He didn't have to do too much. Just by the way he carried himself, his posture, his composed silence, the calm authority in his eyes, people instinctively trusted him. It was something I had seen before in experienced leaders, but to witness it in him, at his age, was fascinating. How was it for you? I asked as we stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. Tyler tilted his head slightly, considering his answer. I mostly just watched and listened, he admitted. But it was definitely useful. I studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. You didn't say a word today. You just stood beside me like my assistant, I pointed out lightly. But one day, when you're sitting at the table for your own meetings, if you don't let your shyness hold you back, there's nothing you won't be able to handle. I turned toward him then, lowering my voice slightly as I added, I'm telling you this as a 48-year-old woman who's been through more meetings than I can count. You can trust me on this. Tyler met my gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with quiet sincerity, he nodded. I do trust you. His words, so simple and yet so genuine, caught me off guard. For a fleeting second, I wasn't sure how to respond. To break the moment, I gave his shoulder a light tap. Come on, let's grab a coffee. We found a small cafe near the hotel, one of those intimate, understated places where the scent of freshly ground beans lingered in the air. Tyler stirred his coffee absently, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. I watched him for a moment before speaking casually. So, what about your personal life? I asked, lifting my cup to my lips. He glanced at me, his brow arching slightly. What do you mean? I shrugged. How are things with women? There was a brief pause before a faint smirk played at the corners of his mouth. To be honest, there's not much to tell. I didn't believe him, not for a second. Even in the short time we'd been sitting there, I had noticed the way women looked at him. The barista behind the counter, the passers-by outside, even the other tables nearby, some subtle, some bolder, but all of them noticed him. And yet, Tyler seemed utterly oblivious to it. Or maybe he just didn't care. That realization unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was a small thing, perhaps even trivial, but it nagged at the edges of my thoughts, irritating in a way I couldn't fully understand. Which was ridiculous. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have meant anything. And yet, I couldn't ignore the sharpness in my movements as I set my coffee cup down a little too firmly on the table. The soft clink of porcelain against wood sounded louder than it should have, betraying the quiet frustration simmering beneath my skin. "Let's go back to the hotel," I said abruptly. Tyler gave me a questioning look, one brow lifting slightly in surprise, but he didn't ask why. He simply nodded and fell into step beside me. As we left the cafe, we walked in silence. The cool evening air should have soothed me, but my irritation remained persistent and unshaken. Each step felt heavier than the last, my thoughts tangled in a way I couldn't unravel. By the time we reached the hotel, I still hadn't dared to unpack the emotions clawing at my chest. Maybe that was why I wasn't paying attention. Maybe that's why I didn't notice the slight misstep. Just as we neared the elevator, my heel slipped against the polished floor. A sharp, searing pain shot through my ankle, and before I could even process what was happening, I gasped. "Ah!" The world tilted for a brief, terrifying second. I was weightless, completely unmoored. But then, before I could hit the ground, strong hands caught me. Tyler. His arm wrapped firmly around my waist, steadying me before I could even comprehend the fall. My breath hitched as I found myself pressed against him, my hands gripping his shoulders on instinct. Too close. My heart pounded. "Are you okay?" His voice was low, laced with concern. I looked up at him, and that was a mistake. His eyes, warm and searching, were right there, impossibly close, filled with something I couldn't name, something that made my stomach tighten. I swallowed, forcing myself to focus. "I think I twisted it. We need to get you to the room," he said without hesitation. Before I could protest, he slid his arm more securely around my back, keeping me upright as the elevator doors closed behind us. The space suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. My ankle throbbed, sending sharp pulses of pain up my leg, but embarrassingly, that wasn't what held my attention. It was him. The way his arm fit around my waist. The way I was leaning into him, my fingers curled into the fabric of his jacket. The way this simple act of support felt far too natural. The elevator chimed as we reached our floor, and I attempted to take a step, determined to prove I could make it on my own. Big mistake. The moment my foot touched the ground, another wave of pain shot through me, stealing my balance. I stumbled, wincing. Tyler noticed instantly. Before I could protest, he moved without hesitation, scooping me up into his arms as if I weighed nothing. I let out a startled sound, my eyes widening. Are you seriously carrying me?" He smirked, his grip tightening just slightly. "You're not exactly giving me much of a choice here." That teasing tone, that familiar lilt in his voice, sent an unwelcome shiver down my spine. My stomach flipped, heat rising to my cheeks. He adjusted his hold, securing me effortlessly against his chest, and suddenly, all I could feel was him. The warmth radiating from his body, the steady, solid strength of his arms, the quiet, even rhythm of his breathing. I shouldn't have noticed these things. I shouldn't have let them affect me. And yet, as he carried me down the hallway, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. By the time we reached the room, my heart was beating far too fast. Tyler set me down carefully on the bed, adjusting my legs with practiced ease. But in the process, the hem of my skirt shifted, folding awkwardly. I should have reached to fix it, but I didn't, because my eyes were on Tyler, and his eyes were on me, lingering a moment too long. Then, just as suddenly, he exhaled, breaking the tension. He shook his head slightly, as if shaking off a thought. "I'll get some ice," he murmured, stepping toward the mini fridge. And I stayed there, thinking about things I shouldn't be thinking about, feeling things I had no business feeling. Thank you for staying with us till the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't yet subscribed, I invite you to hit that subscribe button. Your support, even if it seems like a small gesture, means the world to us and drives us to keep creating content with heart. Don't forget to give it a like if you enjoyed what we shared today. Every interaction helps us grow and allows us to keep connecting with you through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.